I've always been drawn to the woods, ever since I was a kid. There's something about the silence, the way the world seems to shrink down to just you and the trees, that always made me feel both small and free. In 2018, after a rough breakup and a few months of feeling lost in my own life, I decided to take a solo trip to a remote forest in the Pacific Northwest. I'd read about an old fire watch tower deep in the woods, abandoned for decades, and decided to make it my destination. The hike was supposed to be about 6 hours, but the trail was barely marked, and the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to swallow me whole. The first few hours were peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the pines, birds called overhead, and the only sounds were my boots crunching on the undergrowth and the occasional snap of a twig. I stopped for lunch by a small creek, feeling the kind of calm you only get when you're truly alone. I remember thinking that this was exactly what I needed, a break from people, from noise, from everything that had been weighing me down. But as the afternoon wore on, the forest changed. The trees grew denser, the light dimmer. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. A deer, maybe, or just the wind, but it always felt like something was watching. By the time I reached the Firewatch Tower, the sun was low and the air had a chill. The tower itself was a skeleton of rusted metal and weathered wood, creaking in the wind. I climbed the ladder, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. The view from the top was breathtaking, endless forest in every direction, the sky painted orange and purple by the setting sun. I set up my sleeping bag and cooked a quick meal, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. I sat on the edge of the platform, legs dangling into the night, and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw it. A faint, flickering light moving through the trees below. At first, I thought it was another hiker, maybe someone camping nearby. But the light was too erratic, weaving between the trunks in a way that didn't make sense. It stopped at the base of the tower, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a figure stepped into the moonlight. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person, standing perfectly still, looking up at me. I called out, my voice trembling, but they didn't respond. They just stood there, silent and unmoving, until finally, they turned and melted back into the darkness. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the tower, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. I kept telling myself it was just another camper, maybe someone lost or curious. But deep down, I knew something was off. When dawn finally broke, I packed up and climbed down, my hands shaking. At the base of the tower, I found footprints in the mud. Bare feet, wide and splayed, leading off into the trees. I followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into the undergrowth. I never saw the figure again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched all night. I hiked out as fast as I could, never looking back. To this day, I still wonder who or what was out there with me in the woods. But the story doesn't end there. That night changed something in me. I started reading about the history of the Firewatch Tower, trying to find any explanation for what I'd seen. I found old newspaper clippings about a ranger who'd gone missing decades ago, his last known location that very tower. Some people said he'd lost his mind after too many nights alone. Others whispered about strange lights and voices in the woods. The more I read, the more I realized how many people had stories like mine. Stories of being watched, of seeing things that shouldn't be there, of feeling a presence just out of sight. I tried to put it all behind me, to chalk it up to exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But sometimes, late at night, I'll find myself lying awake, listening to the wind outside my window, and I'll remember the silence of the forest, the way the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. I'll remember the feeling of being utterly alone, and the knowledge that something or someone was out there with me. If you ever find yourself alone in the woods, pay attention to the signs. Trust your gut, and if you see a light moving through the trees or hear footsteps in the darkness, don't ignore it. The woods are beautiful, but they're also full of secrets, and sometimes those secrets are better left undisturbed. There's a certain kind of silence you only find deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road or house. It's not the peaceful quiet you get in a park or a backyard, but a heavy, pressing silence that makes you aware of every breath, every heartbeat, every tiny sound. My friend Mark was always chasing that kind of solitude. He'd been camping alone for years, always looking for the most remote places, the spots you couldn't find on any map. One summer, he found a place deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a hidden lake surrounded by thick forest, miles from the nearest trailhead. He parked his truck at the end of a dirt road and hiked in with nothing but a backpack, a tent, and a fishing rod. The first night was uneventful. Mark set up camp by the water, cooked some fish over the fire, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. He woke up with the sunrise, feeling more rested than he had in months. The air was cool and fresh, the sky a perfect blue. He spent the day exploring the area, following animal trails through the undergrowth, climbing over mossy rocks, and wading into the shallows to catch his dinner. It was exactly the kind of escape he'd been hoping for. But on the second day, things started to feel strange. Mark noticed odd marks in the dirt near his campsite, circles, lines, and what looked like handprints. At first, he thought it was just animals, maybe raccoons or a bear, but the marks were too precise, too deliberate. Some of the circles were perfectly round, and the handprints were too large to belong to any animal he knew. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just his imagination, or maybe the work of another camper who'd passed through before him. That evening, as he was gathering firewood, he heard voices in the distance. Not loud, but just loud enough to make out the rhythm of speech. He sikatete, awed out, thinking maybe there were other campers nearby, but the voices stopped instantly. The woods fell silent, the kind of silence that presses in on your ears and makes your skin crawl. Mark stood still for a long moment, listening, but the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the distant call of a bird. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the wind or his imagination. But as night fell, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He sat by the fire, clutching his flashlight, and listened to the sounds of the forest. Every so often, he'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, but whenever he shone his light into the trees, there was nothing there. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Around midnight, he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling his camp. He stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, as the footsteps moved closer, then stopped just outside the ring of firelight. He could see a shadow, tall and thin, standing just beyond the glow. Mark called out, his voice barely more than a whisper, but the shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The fire crackled, and the air felt thick with tension. After what felt like hours, the shadow finally melted back into the darkness. Mark didn't sleep at all that night. He sat by the dying fire, eyes fixed on the trees, waiting for the shadow to return. Every time he thought he heard something, his heart would race, but nothing ever came into the light. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the trees, he felt a wave of relief so strong he almost laughed. At first light, he packed up and hiked out, moving as quickly as he could. The woods felt different in the morning, less threatening, more familiar, but the memory of the shadow lingered. When he reached his truck, he found a small bundle of sticks tied together with twine, sitting on the hood. It was a simple thing, but it sent a chill down his spine. He never figured out what it meant, but he's never camped alone since. Mark told me this story over a campfire one night, years after it happened. He said he still dreams about that shadow, about the feeling of being watched by something he couldn't see. He said the woods never felt the same after that the silence was no longer comforting, but full of hidden dangers. I could see the fear in his eyes as he spoke, the way his hands trembled just a little as he poked at the fire. I've heard other stories like Mark's, stories of people who went into the woods looking for peace and found something else instead. Some say it's just the mind playing tricks, the result of too much isolation and too little sleep. But others believe there's something out there, something ancient and unknowable, watching from the shadows. I don't know what to believe. All I know is that the woods are full of mysteries, and sometimes it's better not to know the answers. If you ever find yourself alone in the woods, remember Mark's story. Pay attention to the signs. Trust your instincts, and if you see a shadow standing just beyond the firelight, don't ignore it. The woods are beautiful, but they're also full of secrets. And sometimes, those secrets are better left undisturbed. I always thought I was prepared for anything the woods could throw at me. I'd been hiking and camping since I was a teenager, and I prided myself on my sense of direction, my ability to read a map, and my calm under pressure. But the last fall, I learned that the forest doesn't care how prepared you think you are. It has its own rules, and sometimes it decides to remind you just how small and vulnerable you really are. It started as a simple plan: hike a section of the Superior hiking trail in Minnesota that I'd never done before. I'd read online that this stretch was less traveled, known for its rugged terrain and isolation. That was exactly what I wanted. A few days away from everything, just me and the wild. I packed my gear, checked the weather, and set out early one crisp October morning. The air was sharp, the leaves just starting to turn, and the trail was narrow, winding through dense forest and over rocky ridges. For the first few hours, I didn't see another soul. I stopped for lunch on a bluff overlooking a river, feeling completely at peace. The world felt far away, and I let myself relax, soaking in the silence. But as the afternoon wore on, the weather changed. Clouds rolled in and a cold wind picked up. The forest grew darker, the trail harder to follow. I checked my map and realized I was farther from my planned campsite than I'd thought. I picked up the pace, but the trail seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't match the map. Every landmark looked the same. Endless trees, mossy rocks, fallen logs. As dusk fell, I realized I was lost. My phone had no signal, and the GPS was glitching. I tried retracing my steps, but the trail had vanished, swallowed by the undergrowth. Panic set in. I called out, hoping someone might hear, but the only answer was the wind. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself of all the survival tips I'd read over the years. I decided to make camp where I was, figuring I'd try to find the trail in the morning. I set up my tent in a small clearing and built a fire, trying to keep my fear at bay. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of a branch. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too human. They circled the tent, slow and steady, crunching the leaves with each step. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps stopped right outside the door. I waited, heart pounding, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, fading into the darkness. I lay awake until dawn, every nerve on edge. When morning came, I stepped outside and found a single boot print in the mud, larger than my own, pointing away from the tent. I never saw or heard anyone else on the trail, and when I finally found my way back to the main path, I felt a wave of relief so strong I nearly cried. But the sense of unease didn't leave me. As I hiked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Every time the wind rustled the leaves, I jumped. Every shadow seemed to move. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and stressed and reading too much into every sound. But then, I started noticing other things, small piles of stones arranged in strange patterns, sticks tied together with twine, and once, a scrap of faded fabric caught on a branch. None of it made sense, and the further I went, the more I felt like I was being herded, guided along a path I couldn't see. By the time I reached the next campsite, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I set up my tent, built a fire, and tried to relax, but the feeling of being watched never left. I dreamed of footsteps circling my tent, of voices whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I woke up drenched in sweat, the fire burned down to embers, the woods scent and still. The next day, I pushed myself to finish the hike as quickly as possible. I barely stopped to eat or drink, moving as fast as I could through the tangled forest. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car waiting, I felt a surge of relief so intense I almost laughed. But as I loaded my gear into the trunk, I noticed something on the windshield, a small bundle of sticks tied together with twine. just like the one Mark had found on his truck years before. I don't know who or what left it there. I don't know if it was a warning, a message, or just a coincidence. But I haven't hiked alone since. The woods are beautiful, but they're also full of secrets. And sometimes, those secrets follow you home. There's a strange comfort in believing you're alone in the woods. It's easy to imagine that the only things out there are the trees, the wind, and the distant calls of birds. But after what happened to me, and after hearing stories from others, I've come to realize that the woods are never truly empty. There's always something watching, something listening, just out of sight. Sometimes it's an animal, sometimes it's another person, and sometimes it's something you can't quite explain. After my experience on the Superior hiking trail, I started paying more attention to the stories people told about the woods. I found online forums, late-night radio shows, and even a few old books filled with accounts of strange happenings in the forest. Some stories were simple. Odd noises, glimpses of movement in the trees, the feeling of being watched. Others were more unsettling. People vanishing without a trace, campsites found abandoned, strange symbols carved into tree trunks. One story that stuck with me came from a woman named Lisa, who'd spent years hiking and camping alone. She told me about a night she spent near a remote lake in the Rockies. She woke up to the sound of someone whispering outside her tent, but when she looked, there was no one there. The next morning, she found small piles of stones arranged in a circle around her campsite. She said she'd never felt fear like that before, and she never camped alone again. Another man, an experienced outdoorsman named Greg, said he was followed for miles by something he never saw, but could hear moving through the brush just out of sight. Every time he stopped, it stopped. Every time he moved, it moved. He never saw what it was, but the feeling of being hunted stayed with him long after he left the woods. He told me that the worst part wasn't the fear, but the uncertainty, the not knowing what was out there or why it was follows, wing him. I started to notice patterns in these stories. The sense of being watched, the strange symbols, the bundles of sticks or stones left behind. It was as if the woods had their own language, their own way of communicating with those who dared to enter. Some people said it was just superstition, the result of too much isolation and too little sleep. But others believed there was something ancient and unknowable in the forest, something that watched from the shadows and left signs for those who knew how to read them. I couldn't help but think back to my own experiences. The footprints at the fire watch tower, the bundle of sticks on my car, the feeling of being herded along a path I couldn't see. It all seemed connected somehow, as if the woods were trying to tell me something. I started to wonder if maybe the fear I felt wasn't just in my head, but a warning. A way of keeping me safe from something I couldn't understand. One night, I decided to test my theory. I went back to the woods, this time with a friend. We camped in a spot I'd never been before, deep in a national forest, far from any road or trail. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat in silence as the darkness closed in around us. I told my friend about the stories I'd heard, about the things I'd seen, and he laughed it off, saying it was just my imagination. But as the night wore on, the woods grew silent. The wind died down, the crickets stopped chirping, and the only sound was the crackle of the fire. We both felt it, the sense of being watched, the prickling on the back of your neck that tells you you're not alone. My friend tried to brush it off, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Around midnight, we heard footsteps in the darkness, slow and deliberate, circling our camp. We shone our flashlights into the trees, but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Then from somewhere just beyond the firelight, we heard a low, guttural sound, half growl, half whisper. It sent a chill down my spine, and my friend's face went pale. We didn't sleep that night. We sat by the fire until dawn, listening to the sounds of the woods, waiting for something to step into the light. But nothing ever did. When the sun finally rose, we packed up and left, moving quickly through the trees, never looking back. On the drive home, my friend admitted he'd never felt fear like that before. He said he'd always thought the stories were just that. Stories. But now, he wasn't so sure. I told him that the woods have a way of reminding you how small you are, how little you really know about the world." He nodded, staring out the window, lost in thought. Since then, I've heard even more stories. People who saw lights in the trees, who heard voices calling their names, who found strange symbols carved into the bark. Some people say it's just your mind playing tricks on you, the result of isolation and fear. But others believe there's something out there, something that watches from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that the woods are full of mysteries, and sometimes it's better not to know the answers. If you ever find yourself alone in the woods, pay attention to the signs. Trust your instincts, and if you feel like you're being watched, you probably are. Even after all these years, the memories of those nights in the woods still haunt me. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and the world is quiet, I can almost hear the wind moving through the trees, the distant snap of a twig, the soft crunch of footsteps on leaves. It's strange how the mind works, how a single experience can echo through your life, changing the way you see the world forever. I used to think of the woods as a place of peace, a refuge from the chaos of everyday life. Now I know they hold secrets that most people will never understand. After my last trip, I tried to go back to my normal routine. I went to work, met friends for coffee, watched movies on the weekends. But something had changed. I found myself glancing over my shoulder when I walked home at night, double-checking the locks on my doors and windows. The city noises that used to annoy me now felt comforting, a reminder that I wasn't alone. But the fear lingered, just beneath the surface, waiting for a quiet moment to rise up and remind me of what I'd seen, and what I couldn't explain. I started reading more about other people's experiences, hoping to find some comfort in the idea that I wasn't alone in what I'd felt. I found forums and message boards filled with stories just like mine, people who'd gone into the woods seeking peace or adventure, only to come back with memories they couldn't explain. Some talked about seeing strange lights, others about hearing voices or footsteps when no one else was around. A few even described encounters with people or things that didn't seem quite human. One story stuck with me. A man wrote about camping with his dog in a remote part of the Rockies. In the middle of the night, his dog started growling at the tent wall, hackles raised, teeth bared. The man unzipped the tent, expecting to see a bear or a coyote, but there was nothing there, just the empty woods, sea, island, and still. But his dog wouldn't calm down. It kept staring into the darkness, growling low and steady, until finally, as dawn broke, it relaxed and lay down. The man never saw anything, but he said he'd never felt fear like that before, and he never camped alone again. Another story came from a woman who'd been hiking in the Pacific Northwest. She said she'd gotten lost and spent the night in a makeshift shelter. All night, she heard what sounded like children laughing in the distance, even though she knew there was no one else for miles. In the morning, she found small handprints in the mud around her shelter, too small to belong to any adult. She left the woods that day and never went back. These stories, and so many others, made me realize that the fear I felt wasn't just in my head. There's something about the woods that brings out a primal terror, a sense that we're not at the top of the food chain, that there are things out there older and stranger than we can understand. I started to wonder if maybe the woods remember us too. Maybe every time someone gets lost or sees something they can't explain, it's the forest reminding us that we're guests in its world, not the other way around. Maybe that's why so many people feel drawn to the woods, even knowing the risks, because there's a part of us that craves that fear, that wants to brush up against the unknown, if only for a moment. But the price of that thrill is the lingering fear, the memories that never quite fade. I still go hiking, still spend time in nature, but I'm never truly at ease. I keep my eyes open, my senses sharp, always listening for the sound of footsteps that don't belong, or the flicker of a light where there shouldn't be one. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear whispers in the trees, calling me back to the woods. I don't know if I'll ever answer that call again, but if I do, I'll be ready. Because now I know the woods are never truly empty, and we're never truly alone. I've learned to trust my instincts, to listen to that little voice in the back of my mind that says, "You're not alone." If you ever find yourself alone in the woods, pay attention to the signs. Trust your gut, and if you see a light moving through the trees or hear footsteps in the darkness, don't ignore it. The woods are beautiful, but they're also full of secrets. And sometimes those secrets are better left undisturbed. Even now, as I write this, I can feel the weight of those memories pressing in around me. The woods are calling, as they always do, but I know better than to answer. I know that some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved, some questions are better left unasked. The next time you find yourself standing at the edge of the forest, looking into the shadows, remember my story. Remember the stories of those who came before you. And remember that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you can see, but the ones you can't. So if you ever feel that chill run down your spine, if you ever sense eyes watching you from the darkness, don't brush it off. Don't tell yourself it's nothing, because in the woods, nothing is ever just nothing. There's always something out there, waiting, watching, listening. And if you're lucky, you'll make it out with nothing more than a story to tell, and a fear that never quite goes away.